Okay, first of all, to give some context, it's hard to determine the most balanced or objective perspective, if such a thing exists, when it comes to evaluating a show like this. There's simply too much to consider, too many distinct audiences, each with its own perspective, and most justifiable, or at the very least understandable. Some come to it as a modern generation of fantasy fans looking to connect with the origins of the genre and familiarize themselves with its more classic form. They want to deepen their appreciation for the elements of fantasy for which Tolkien is so widely loved.
Mordor, after all, is a principle of absolute evil.
You don't believe in absolute evil, but you believe in absolute good.
Yeah.
Let's say,
If you don't believe in absolute evil, why did you create the Dark Lord, who seems to be the apotheosis of it?
But he said in the book that he himself was not evil to begin with.
Ah, he fell.
Mm-hmm.
Then, like Lucifer.
Yeah.
So you're...
Well, he's several stages down from Lucifer.
Their appreciation for elements such as lore or world building, or the grand allegorical scope of a story as richly and thoroughly developed as Tolkien's. There are others who are simply solid fantasy fans and who recognize this as the next big thing. They're less sentimentally invested in Tolkien for Tolkien's sake, but are every bit as enthusiastic about story in general. It's also obviously true, though controversial to say it, that someone can be more interested in story, even in fantasy, than a Tolkien fan. Or they can be interested in different ways, or they can be interested in television or fantasy television or the modern adaptation of historical works. Then there are the lifelong Tolkien diehards, the Tolkien scholars, as some enjoy styling themselves. And even if you feel a natural urge to chuckle at that, it shouldn't just be waved aside. The very fact that such a label exists speaks to the iconic place of this work in literary history and in culture. You can argue that our culture has misplaced its values, that it has overblown the importance of narrative fiction, but our culture has given rise to this subculture which reveres Tolkien's work with a quite religious zeal. The point is, there are endless sorts of people who can be grouped into endless categories, and we must acknowledge the sincerity, or at least the possibility of sincerity, in their sentiments towards the Rings of Power and the world of Tolkien himself. Regardless of the category in which we each find ourselves, we should at least try to imagine that those in other categories are possessed of convictions somewhat like our own. Perhaps they have slightly different values. Some feel political inclusion is more important than some dusty old story written by a dusty old Englishman some many decades ago. They feel that augmenting the story, seeing it evolve to something better, this might be a defensible approach, might be a superior approach. That's what we do, after all, with historic religions, myths, arts, rituals, and so on. Despite their numerous and obvious flaws, their incompatibility with modern society, we study them in an attempt to learn about ourselves, and then we tweak them. Rather than abandoning whatever parts of them are obsolete, we respin and elaborate upon them. At a certain point, if a work becomes iconic enough, is it not an incredible compliment to honor it with this same process? Consider Tolkien. He himself was considered something of a heretic by so many. Certainly his works could be seen as a wild shift in the landscape of literary fiction. In a day of much more rigorous Christianity, his dabbling with Old Norse and Celtic symbols was seen by some as dangerously pagan. He created an entire mythology, complete with God and angels and demons. While his stories can be seen as forwarding something of a Christian belief, Tolkien stated outright he didn't want them to be considered allegorical. It is neither allegorical nor topical, he said. I cordially dislike allegory in all its manifestations. I much prefer history, true or feigned, with its varied applicability to the thought and experience of the readers. So Tolkien's work wasn't nearly as monotheistic or as Christian as, for example, Lewis's Narnia. One single godlike creator birthed Arda, sure, but there were numerous beings who excelled in magic and song and craftsmanship, and each of these was fundamental to the weaving of Tolkien's world, his races, and the conflict that they brought about. What's the point? The point is, story is always evolving, and we are always evolving upon it. To respin something of the past is not always seen as an abomination, and indeed is often seen as a sort of honor. Now, there are very clear and arguable reasons as to why in this case it might be an abomination. We'll get to those. For now, I merely want to point out that Tolkien himself adapted and respun cultural material that predated him. Even the Nordics and the Celts who so inspired him, even they adapted and respun. That's what humanity has always done. So there are possible audiences which wish to honor certain characteristics of Tolkien's work while discarding or altering others. This can be a completely genuine and good-willed attitude, though it can also be corrupted by all the sorts of things that corrupt us as humans: monetization, politicization, personal insecurity, or inability to create new and original material, whatever. Then some feel that the dusty old Englishman was a titan of literary genius and that his work, above all, should stand as sacrosanct in the genre to which it essentially gave birth. Some may recognize flaws in Tolkien's work, but consider it an abomination to meddle with anyone's art for any reason, certainly for the sake of political appeasement. They may even feel that more social progress can be made in recognizing and discussing the true original nature of that work. Why do we feel we can meddle with Homer's work? It seems to have something to do with the fact that the man's long gone and that we can all collectively value an elaboration upon his stories. But maybe it's too much to meddle with Tolkien's work because he's only just died and his fans are very much still frothing at the bit.
So the fact that we're going to be seeing things that are potentially going to make us love the Hobbit films and the Lord of the Rings films and potentially the books as well. And potentially the books as well.
Well, that's not good.
Above it all, of course, Amazon's marketing team looms like Ungoliant, sucking the lifeblood from light of clarity, sowing bitterness in our midst, robbing us of hope. I have no doubt they designed some of this outrage and are reveling in it amidst pools of money and champagne. And here's me contributing to it, greedily lapping up what attention I can glean. But to the point, is there some conceivable defense that can be offered for this nonsense? Suppose for a moment that all voices feel the same as we do, equally convicted. Maybe they don't, maybe some of them are wrong, maybe some of them are wrong for reasons of bitterness, weakness, hurt, blindness. Great Iluvatar, maybe some of them are wrong for reasons of downright moral inferiority. But, for now, let's try to look at Rings of Power with an open and a forgiving mind. Let's actually try to consider arguments for the side we naturally disagree with, just in case it has something to offer. My main consideration here is, what if it was always doomed? Beyond the scripting, beyond the armor, beyond the womanly, middle-aged aura of our elven warriors, what if there was simply no way to turn this story into anything satisfactory? Consider Galadriel. As we all know, she's coming across as incredibly petulant and rash, bitter and entitled. It's nothing like the Galadriel we know, and regardless of the Galadriel we know, it's nothing like a character like her should be. After thousands of years of life, there are certain qualities that would, or at least should, grow in a person, right? Well, maybe we're just getting ahead of the show. They do need a story, after all. They need room for her to grow, and when I stop and ask myself what a thousands of years old elf would be like, and how I would write such an elf, it does get pretty weird.
Do not let the great emptiness of Khazad-dûm fill your heart, Gimli, son of Gloin. For the world has grown full of
I know what it is you saw. For it is also in my mind.
Do not let your hearts be troubled. Go now and rest. Tonight, you will sleep.
Welcome, Frodo of the Shire. One who has seen the eye.
It does get pretty weird. In order to write a character like that to be relatable and compelling, you have to start with an empathizable struggle. For Galadriel, they obviously chose her entitled petulance, her hot-headedness, and an air of general condescension.
Conflicted.
But how to make us believe it? How to make us feel it? I feel like there are two possible mentalities here. Mentality one is that people don't really get wiser as they age, or at least they don't inevitably get wiser. People who are stubborn and arrogant and selfish fools turn into old stubborn and arrogant and selfish fools. There are good arguments for this. It's widely known that people get stuck in their ways, that we need youth and death in order to actually affect change in society, in order to keep society open enough that it is open to the mutation it needs to develop and survive in an evolving environment. So what would happen to an elf, immortal? Well, mentality one could see them becoming, or remaining, quite immature, petulant, arrogant, bull-headed, and all the things that come when you live for a long time with things one way and then you don't want them to change. That's actually one of the primary motifs defining elven peoples across fantasy. They live in the past. They look ever back. They're slow to act, to make friends, to forget. It makes sense. Elves are of starlight, of memory, of dreamy songs in slumbering forests, watching the growing of the trees and dancing timelessly in moonlight. Men are of sunlight and fire, bright and burning in an instant, growing and multiplying at terrible speed. Men rise to great nobility and fall to great darkness within the span of decades, a bare handful of years. Now often they're sort of unevenly presented, these two peoples. The qualities of elves are seen as noble, restrained, harmonious, and wise. The qualities of men are seen as fleeting, unreliable, overfearful, selfish. The perspective of man is endearingly childlike at best, and then cruel or apocalyptic at worst. This has worked in the past because we haven't had to relate to any elven characters on a personal level. Let's think about Tolkien's work a bit. Consider his most recognizable elves. Legolas, Galadriel, Celeborn, Glorfindel, Fëanor, Fingolfin, Finwë, and so on. Some of them were major players in the world, but they were never major characters. They aren't characters at all, really. Tolkien never needs us to feel for them with anything near what we feel for Sam or Frodo or Boromir. If we are to view the elves as the fair folk, inhuman in their wisdom and their purity, we're simply not going to relate to them. We do need to give them struggle to make a show like this. I would argue that Tolkien's world doesn't preclude this. I would argue that it demands it, sure. The problem is not that Tolkien's elves were perfect, though. The problem is that their faults were only ever described in such mythic, distant tones. Look at Fëanor, greatest of all the Noldor. He's clearly one of the most conflicted and calamitous characters in the entire saga. First of all, it's said he drew so much of Miriel's energy when he was born that she grew weary of living and departed to Lorien, where she voluntarily left her corporeal form and died. It's said, for Fëanor was made the mightiest in all parts of body and mind, in valor, in endurance, in beauty, in understanding, in skill, in strength and subtlety alike, of all the children of Ilúvatar, and a bright flame was in him. Yet in his greatness he was full of fear and pride and jealousy. He created the Silmarils in fearing that the trees of Valinor might someday be extinguished. He guarded the Silmarils in jealousy and mistrust of the Valar, mistrust of his own kin. In his paranoia he oversaw the forging of the first weapons. He refused to offer the Silmarils up after the trees were destroyed. After the Silmarils was stolen, he slew his own blood in his thirst for vengeance and his desperation to recover the jewels. Consider Maeglin, who betrayed Gondolin to Melkor because he was promised lordship in the hand of his cousin, whom he had long coveted. That's lifted somewhat directly from the Bible, and is an example of an elf twisting against the design of things in more ways than one.
Jamie and I are more than brother and sister. We shared a womb. Came into this world together, we belong together.
This sort of thing is extremely prevalent through Tolkien's world building. People are tortured, their minds are snapped. Gollum was a hobbit-like creature, driven mad by a combination of the ring and Sauron's dungeons. Heroes are stripped naked when slain and paraded before the walls of elven fortresses. Tolkien's evil is very evil, as his good is very good. It's my opinion that the strange aura of reverence and mythic otherworldliness people give it is not an active desire of his to avoid exploring the gritty depths of evil. It's more a result of the literary age to which Tolkien belonged. It was an age defined by this sweeping mythic scope, by poetic and slow-moving prose, by distance from the sort of intimate, gritty detail that features heavily in modern storytelling. But again, it's all written about with such a literary voice, from a place of literary distance. It's just a strange thing to have to do, to take Tolkien's mythic world and make a story out of it. Any story, much less a television series, much less a modern television series based on old characters who, while very well established in certain ways, are also extremely distant, formal, most godlike in spirit and mien. People like Miriel and Galadriel and Elrond and Pharazôn, if we're to be interested in the show, they are necessarily going to be humanized. And part of that is the exploration of their flaws, so maybe Galadriel, even after 3,000 years, isn't inevitably going to mature. Remember, Amazon doesn't have the rights to the Silmarillion, or even the Unfinished Tales, if I'm not mistaken. I've heard people claim they do, but I'm fairly sure that's wrong. I think they have the rights to the appendices of The Lord of the Rings, the content in that saga, and I think that's it. That's crazy. That's scraps. Maybe it was doomed from the start. Now, it's in every way a completely fabricated story. Amazon has taken their scraps from the appendices, and they've tried to elaborate upon them. So we can certainly dissect what Amazon has added, the characters, acting, scripting, pacing, in as much as it is Amazon's. Yes, it's still terrible. It's unsavable. All I'm saying is when we consider the source material, when we consider legal constraint, when we consider the aura of sanctity and nostalgia that Arda enjoys, well, maybe we should have expected something at least 60% this divisive. I don't know, my own personal fury doesn't so much come from the betrayal of Galadriel's character, or the shortening of elven hair, or from Elrond's air of delicate youthful harmlessness. I wasn't expecting this to be a Tolkien-esque production. I don't really have any personal fury, actually, because my expectations were quite low. But yes, there's frustration, because when I divorce myself from all the Tolkien-esque considerations, and when I consider Amazon's creativity in and of itself, yes, it's still quite bad, but at least it's not as bad, and at least we can understand there were a dozen factors tugging at them. I guess to conclude, I'd say we should simply ask ourselves a couple things. Do we blame the Tolkien estate for selling the rights? Do we blame Amazon for buying them? If so, who do we blame? Do we blame Bezos, who's running a business? Do we blame the showrunners, who are basically just pursuing their careers while trying to juggle all these confusing factors while being howled at by a dozen different voices? Do we blame the culture for allowing this sort of thing to happen? Do we blame the concept of rights in the first place? Do we blame the creative diminishing of our generation, which seems only able to adapt and repurpose icons of the past? Do we blame the writers?
There's a tempest in me. It swept me to this island for a reason. And it will not be quelled by you, Regent.
Yes, we blame the writers.
So why don't you come out with it?
Because a burden shared may either be halved or doubled, depending on the heart that receives it.
Oh, Owl's beard! Enough with the quail sauce! Give me the meat, and give it to me raw.
Yes, we blame the writers. If we do blame them, though, why? Are we convinced they were untrue to themselves and sacrificed true quality or honor for the sake of political or financial gain? Maybe, but we never knew them personally, and we did know the sort of venture this was. This was a for-profit venture by a for-profit company dealing with mere scraps of source material from content about which everyone seems extremely zealous. We knew what this could turn into, and still we watched it. Still we paid our money to the behemoth, and still we watched. What place of reverence have we given Tolkien all these years? And should we? He's an icon of literature, certainly, but how much of our identity should be founded in him alone? Should we not secure our own creative pursuits, looking on to greater things in our age? Should we be so thoroughly devastated, as if Tolkien's the only island of salvation we might hope to ever have? Just how deep should our complaints resonate? Are we, too, using this as a chance to simply add to the noise? Or do we think we can actually build something better from the ashes? Can we write something better? Where is it? I don't even know what I'm saying right now. That's the sort of sum of part 1 of In Defense of the Rings of Power. The point was, maybe this was doomed to be at least 60% disappointing from the beginning. In part 2, I'll dive into further detail regarding the characterization in the source material, specifically the characterization of Galadriel. We'll look at how Appendices Galadriel compares to characters in other successful fantasy adaptations, namely the Lord of the Rings trilogy, Game of Thrones. For now, though, please subscribe, like, comment,